afternoon. My name is Andrea Ghianda. I'm the communication specialist of the Italian G20 Finance Track Presidency. Welcome to the press conference of the G20 High-Level Panel on Financing the Global Commons for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. Daniele Franco is approaching the room and he will give some introductory remarks. Minister Franco will not take any question at this time because the conference is still going on and will continue tomorrow. Tomorrow there will be a press conference following the end of the meeting, and you will have plenty of opportunity to address questions to Minister Franco and Governor Visco. I see Minister Franco approaching, so as I mentioned, he will give a few introductory remarks. Please, Minister Franco, I will kindly ask you to approach the podium.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We are here to present the report of the G20 High-Level Independent Panel on Financing the Global Commons for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. This report has just been discussed by the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors. I think this is a unique opportunity to have with us the distinguished co-chairs of the panel who hardly need any introduction. So we have Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Also, when we asked her to join the panel, she was not yet. So congratulations. Then we have Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Senior, sorry for your name, it's very long and difficult to pronounce, but Tharman is the Senior Minister of Singapore, and Lawrence Summers from Harvard University, but former State Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. First of all, I would like to thank them, the co-chair, for all the work they have done, and especially for their leadership and commitment in producing such a robust result over a very short period of time. I believe their efforts have been amply recognized by ministers and central bank governors today. The report titled A Global Deal for Our Pandemic Age has greatly benefited from the work of the project team, comprising staff from Bruegel and the Center for Global Development, and the Executive Secretariat hosted by the United States National Academy of Medicine and the Wellcome Trust. The report is also the result of extensive consultations with key stakeholders, bilateral engagements with international bodies, including those who have undertaken similar works, such as the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response and the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, as well as roundtable with individual experts, have informed the work of the panelists, particularly on the assessment of gaps. As you know, the G20 High-Level Independent Panel was set up in January in recognition of the need to be prepared for future pandemics and to find ways to properly finance global public goods for health. In April, G20 members agreed on the need to invest in global public goods without duplicating or complicating the global health architecture. There is a clear economic case in guaranteeing a systematic and sustainable support to prevention and preparedness, reducing the risks of future global health threats. Of course, G20 members have also discussed the need to take action now to address the current health crisis. Basically, we should work on two lines that is addressing the current crisis and then being prepared for future ones. The report itself recognizes that our immediate and first task should be to end the COVID-19 pandemic. Nevertheless, our main aim today is to discuss what we can do now to reduce the likelihood of similar hazards in the future and how to be better prepared for the response times. The report and the follow-up work represent a crucial deliverable for our presidency, I would say for the G20 work this year. In the coming weeks, we will convene an informal group of experts from the Ministries of Finance and the Ministry of Health together, and from relevant international organizations, in order to review the panel recommendation as well as the ideas and proposals, other ideas and proposals, and to prepare a document with concrete actions that will be discussed and hopefully endorsed during our joint finance and health ministers meeting in October, which will take place just before the head of government meeting, which will take place in Rome at the end of October. We asked the co-chairs to support us during this additional work in between now and October. I think the co-chairs will give you more details on their recommendations. The resonance the press could give to their findings will be instrumental to raise awareness, foster a constructive debate, and eventually build consensus on some new actions. I also count on the continuous support and engagement from the panel in the coming months. So, with that, I concluded my introduction, and I would again thank the three co-chairs and also all the other panelists for the work they have done. When we asked them to produce a report for us, we knew the time was very limited. We knew they were very good, obviously, but we also knew that the time was very limited. And I think we really made a very good choice. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. We know that also your time is very limited, so thank you very much for having the time to make your introduction. We now move to the actual press conference with the three co-chair of the high-level independent panel. And we will have first the three co-chairs with a brief few introductory remarks, and then there will be possibility to open for question and answers. I'll remind you that this press conference is live streamed, and it's also possible to participate remotely via web conferencing tools. So we'll take a few questions from the room, but also questions from the audience that is following online. Let me start by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization and former Nigerian Foreign and Finance Ministers. Please, Director General, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Oh, it works. Thank you. Let me start by commending the Italian G20 presidency and the finance minister in particular for initiating and supporting this important task. I think we all think it's a far-sighted move because the issue of trying to prepare for the next pandemic is probably one of the most crucial issues of our time. I'd like to make 3 points. The first is that after extensive consultations, we did over 200 consultations with civil society, academia, health and finance experts, the pharmaceutical industry, etc. What we have concluded from these consultations is that the COVID-19 pandemic is a dress rehearsal for more dangerous and deadly pandemics to come. And scientists have made clear that this could happen in the next 10 years or less, 20 years, etc. So this human security issue of our times is this pandemic, the most vexed issue of the global commons, along with climate change. And in fact, both of them are really related as threats of the global commons. The implication of all of this is that we must learn the right lessons from this pandemic in order to be well prepared for the next one. I think the second point I want to make, it has to do with the lessons. But before we get there, I think one of the things we need to focus on is that the present pandemic is still there. We mustn't be complacent as more and more people get vaccinated, especially in the developed countries, that this is over with. It's not. It might, in fact, become endemic. And we also have to pay attention to the fact that in the continuing pandemic, vaccine inequity of access between developed and developing countries is a real problem, and we need to address it. The G20 has done well in trying to donate vaccines, support manufacturing and distribution, but it needs to do more, and it needs to take the lead in trying to push forward with more vaccines donations, looking at the supply scarcity through investing in more manufacturing capacity, logistics, and supply chain bottlenecks. I think we need to build that foundation in order to ensure a sustainable economic recovery, as well as dealing with the human consequences of the pandemic. We see that the main lessons is how woefully unprepared we were for this pandemic. We had no early warning systems. Health systems in rich and poor countries alike were weak. They got overloaded quickly and nearly collapsed in some cases. Financing for poor countries was slow to materialize and has not been adequate. And of course, the supply of medical goods, diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics has been very in short supply, leading sometimes to bidding wars of one country against the other. So against this background, there are 4 gaps that we think need to be plugged. The first is that we need a globally networked surveillance and research system to prevent and detect emerging infectious diseases. The second is we need resilient and strong national health systems as a critical foundation for the global preparedness and response. The third is that we need to plug the gap of supply of medical countermeasures and tools to radically shorten the response time to a pandemic and deliver equitable global access. And then the fourth is we need to plug the gap in global governance to ensure that the system is tightly coordinated, properly funded, and has clear accountability. So those 4 gaps, let me now hand over to Tarman to give the essential details of what we're recommending.
Thanks, Ngozi. Let me take off from where Ngozi laid out the broad picture, today's challenges, tomorrow's challenges, what the big gaps are. Let me say that the 3 of us are former finance ministers over several years, together with our colleagues on the panel, who are former central bank governors and other global economic and financial leaders. We've all been through major global crises in the last 30 years, some regional, some global, and of course the global financial crisis 12 years ago. Nothing in our experience compares with the scale and complexity of the challenge we now face, not just in dealing with COVID, which is the immediate challenge, but in preparing for the next pandemic. And the next pandemic will come. We're not talking about a once-in-50-year event. We are talking about a pandemic that can come anytime, 20 years' time, 10 years' time, maybe next year. Completely unprepared. And that's the first thing that struck us, that we are waiting for a crisis. We are waiting once again for the huge human and economic costs of only reacting after a crisis erupts. The good news is that it can be fixed. And in order to fix it, we have to change the way we think about international cooperation in preparing for pandemics, including international cooperation of financing preparedness for pandemics. We have to move away from a concept of bilateral initiatives towards multilateral funding of the system. That's what's lacking in global healthcare security. It's multilateral funding. The system is fragmented. It is addressing specific diseases and specific institutions. The system as a whole is gravely underfunded. And as Ngozi points out, it has major gaps in surveillance of new infectious diseases, major gaps in resilience of national systems, and it lacks global supply capacity, vaccines, treatments, PPEs, oxygen tanks, and the like. Huge gaps. The good news is it can be fixed, and the first way to fix it is to recognize that this cannot be about bilateral funding or aid for individual countries. It has to be about collective investment in global public goods that every country benefits from, rich and poor. Collective investment that every country benefits from, where you invest in facilities internationally, including in individual countries, but because those countries are then better equipped, everyone else benefits. That's the basic idea. And it requires we put each of the institutions on a stronger multilateral footing, including the WHO, which lacks adequate multilateral funding. It also requires that we make a lot more use of the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the other regional development banks, the IMF. They're unique institutions in their ability to leverage resources and their ability to work with governments so that governments also invest in national preparedness. We've got to make quite a bold shift in the mandates of the international financial institutions to treat global public goods and not just country investments for country benefits as their core mandate. And thirdly, the panel has come to the conclusion we need a global funding and governance mechanism on top of what the individual institutions do. Propose a new global fund. We layer a strong multilateral layer on top of a fragmented landscape of funding that exists today. A global fund that will be attracting multilateral funding from a large coalition of countries, and that will deploy funds across the system so that you can plug the gaps, and not just rely on individual institutions and their individual mandates, because that's what has left big gaps in the system. A new global fund, which we call a Global Health Threats Fund, that will need to be about $10 billion in contributions each year. Sounds like a big sum, but it's actually a very small sum, because $10 billion, when spread out over a large number of countries, is typically about 1,000th, about 0.1%, 1,000th of the annual budget of most countries. But what's critical is that we see this as a collective investment that not just helps countries in need, but helps everyone else in the system. And that requires global governance. It requires coordination. We have today global governance for healthcare, which exists through the World Health Assembly, the WTO and the World Health Assembly. But we don't have a global governance mechanism that brings finance together with healthcare. And we're proposing that the G20, the addition of regional organizations and some key developing regions, will provide a sufficiently inclusive framework for this effective global governance, bringing together finance and healthcare. It is a gap in the system today, but it can be filled, and it can be filled effectively. Our greatest risk is that once COVID-19 is over, which is not soon, but once it is over, particularly in the developed countries, And after the exhaustion of the efforts to deal with COVID, the greatest risk is that we go back to the old ways of economizing on short-term investments and waiting to see what happens in future. It's a very costly way of going about national governance and global governance because it means repeated pandemics at huge costs. So we've got to avoid that short-term mentality that has plagued global healthcare security, acting in crisis at huge expense and then waiting for the next crisis to come. We've got to invest in preparedness. It is affordable when it is spread out over countries, and it's the way in which we prevent another large pandemic from occurring, and it can be done. In other words, it may mean 10 billion a year now, maybe more, but we've got to avoid being billions wise, trillions foolish, because if we don't spend those billions, we end up having to spend trillions. So I'll stop there and pass on to Larry.
I'll be very brief. I want to make 3 points. First, for none of us on the panel, is this our first rodeo with a global issue that requires a global collective response. For all of us, this is the first time where we have seen one where the expenditure of tens of billions of dollars is likely to prevent the need for spending tens of trillions of dollars down the road. It is nearly certain that we will see another COVID. Question is whether we will, as an international community, be ready. Second, this is, as Tharman said, a test of our capacity as a crisis plays out to prepare for the next one. The world had that crisis as World War I ended, and it failed. Question with respect to this pandemic is whether the world will do better. And an important part of the answer will be revealed when the leaders meet in Rome in October. We are encouraged by the response that our report received. But ultimately, if this is not the moment that can mobilize people to prepare for pandemics, then when would that moment ever be, given the traumas associated with what we have been through? Third observation that I would make is that pandemic threats, along with climate change, are going to, in our judgment, define the international challenge for finance ministers, for foreign ministers, and for heads of state going forward. If security and prosperity initially have depended on balancing power and balancing trade, today, the greatest threats that we face, climate change and pandemic, and we regard them as differing in their horizons, differing in ways in which they play out over time, but as being comparable and grave threats. Security today depends upon the capacity for global cooperation to meet global challenges in the way that it once depended on the ability to balance power. This is not all negative and about challenges. Because of what would not have been possible even 2 decades ago, given progress in science, given progress in information technology, the opportunity to invest in tens of billions of dollars and avoid tens of trillions of dollars in costs is the public sector equivalent of buying Amazon in the 1990s. It offers immense returns and will be profoundly regretted by any who miss the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Summers. Thank you, Senior Minister Thurman. Thank you, Director General. I think we have about 12 minutes for questions. Let me first remind you that, of course, you can grab a copy of the report, which is now available also online on the G20.org website or at the end of the room for people in the room. Perhaps can I get a feeling of how many people would like to ask a question in the room? Okay, we have one person here. We also can collect questions virtually, so from people participating from remote. Let me remind you that all questions should be in English. We cannot pass you the microphone for the COVID-19 protocol, so I ask you to move to the standing mic over there, so you can ask your question from there. I will ask you please to introduce yourself and your media affiliation before posing the questions, and perhaps to whom you would like to ask your question. And I remind all of you that this press conference is not about the all G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting, but it's about this specific issue treated by the global, high-level panel and the report itself. So please, your question should be related to the topic. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much. My question is to Madam Director General. I'm Cristina Lucrezia-Corner, Editor-in-Chief at Cointelegraph. I would like to also congratulate again for your designation, because this is definitely a great step for all the women who are working in the finance industry. And my question is, how do you see blockchain empowering women in particular and promoting financial inclusion in the pandemic age and beyond in general? Thank you very much.
I think we can already answer to that before collecting any other question. Please.
Well, thank you very much for that interesting question and for your congratulations. Of course, blockchain is something that brings more transparency in the way that business is done and removes intermediaries. And I think that particularly in the finance area, the ability to introduce this into transactions, I think could be beneficial to women who are often excluded from access to finance. So I think this is a good thing, something we should look into. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? I don't see any hand. Let me see in the chat if we have. No, I don't see any questions also from the virtual attendance. I will ask the co-chairs if you have any additional comments or a statement. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. No, I think we're good. So I'll send you again to the G20.org for the recording of this press conference and also for the report and all the information related to the co-chairs and also the high-level panel. I'll thank you, the three co-chairs. Thank you very much for your time today and for all your efforts in putting together this report. Thank you to all the participants attending in the room and all the participants that are watching online. Thank you very much. And let me just remind you that the next press conference is tomorrow at the end end of the meeting at 5:30 p.m. in this same room. Thank you very much and have a good evening.